There are stories that aren't content just to be told. They leave a mark on the heart, no matter how much time has passed. Whether you're from the 70s, 80s, or 90s, maybe you first saw it as a child, a boy climbing up a chimney, his hands covered in ash, his eyes searching for the sky through the dark bricks. This story has appeared in books, in cartoons, and in the conversations of older generations, but it has always carried a strange blend of innocence and cruelty. Today, we'll travel together through the narrow alleys of that time, hearing the faint voices of children echoing inside the chimneys, and stepping closer to their story, as if we were there among the cold and the smoke. But before we begin, tell us in the comments, which generation are you from, and how did you first hear their story? Did you read The Black Brothers? Did you watch a cartoon that hinted at it, like Princess Sarah, A Little Princess, or told it in full, like Romeo's Blue Skies? Before the city opened its eyes, London would breathe quietly, but not clean air. Smoke was always the first to wake, rising from the mouths of chimneys, as if whispering into the gray sky. Every home had a fireplace. Every fireplace needed a fire, and a fire never started on its own. On those cold mornings, a small boy would walk through the back alleys, dragging his feet over wet stones. He carried a wooden basket with a brush, a rope, and some old ash. He'd reach the back door of a house, glance left and right, then knock 3 slow times. No one waited for him. No one asked how he slept or whether he had eaten. He was not a guest, nor a paid worker like the adults. He was simply the chimney boy. The maid would open the door without looking at his face, motion for him to come in, and shut it behind him as if sealing a stove. The house still slept, but he knew the way. He'd walk toward the corner where the fireplace stood, kneel, open the iron grate, and begin pulling out the old ash, as though removing the remains of a night that had not yet cooled. The work hadn't even begun, yet smoke was already starting to fill the room. He might have been 10 years old, or younger, but his face told a different story. Cold, hunger, and long nights make a person grow older too quickly. In the corner sat his basket. In his chest sat something he couldn't name. Maybe fear, maybe exhaustion, or maybe just a single question. Will I come back tonight? But questions didn't matter. The chimney was waiting. The real story begins when the ladder is no longer enough. In the early 19th century, London was growing fast. Houses were built on top of other houses. Chimneys climbed higher into the sky. A single chimney was no longer enough, and ladders could no longer reach the top. Almost every room had a fireplace, and every fireplace had its own chimney. But these chimneys weren't straight. They twisted, narrowed, and split into thin pipes like veins. An adult man could no longer fit inside to clean them. That's when they began searching for a solution. They needed someone who could crawl inside, squeeze through, climb upward without getting stuck. The solution was simple and cruel. Children. They were chosen carefully, very young, very light, unafraid of the dark, or perhaps too young to even know what fear was. Some were no older than 7. The child was given a rope, a brush, and sometimes even a new name, along with a strange title, the climbing boy. It wasn't a job in any normal sense. It was a form of human consumption. The child wasn't treated as a worker, but as a tool. On the first day, he would be tested on a chimney, the way scissors are tested on a piece of cloth. If he slipped through without getting stuck, he was good. If he got stuck, the problem wasn't the chimney, it was the child. and because no law forbade it, and poverty kept silent, the number of climbing boys grew until they became a common sight in every neighborhood. The fireplace would be opened, the child told to climb in, and then he'd vanish into the darkness. In some homes, the ladies of the house would leave the room so they wouldn't hear the scraping sound of a brush against brick. In others, they'd watch the falling ash, a sign the child was still alive and moving, because the tool inside the chimney had to remain small and flexible. Some masters left the boys outside in the cold all winter to slow their growth, to keep them light, to ensure they never outgrew the work. Life inside a chimney was unlike anything else. No sun, no air, no voice asking, "Are you okay?" But the worst was still to come. When the boy stood before the fireplace, it wasn't to admire the fire. It was to enter the same opening the smoke escaped from. He would stretch his small body toward the narrow gap, push himself in with his hands first, then curl up like a kitten sliding under a door. His feet were bare. On his right knee was an old scar. He didn't remember when he got it, but it never went away. Inside, there was no light, no fresh smell of air, only black dust that stuck to the lungs as it did to the silence. Every movement stirred a tiny cloud of soot. Every breath turned into a cough. He would start climbing. There was no ladder. He used his knees and back against the walls, pushing himself upward, inch by inch. As if the chimney were swallowing him every few steps, he'd stop to listen. Was there a sound from outside? Was someone calling his name? Nothing. From the moment he entered, the outside world forgot about him. The walls were so close to his face, he could see the marks left by the fingers of other children before him, some of them still fresh. He kept climbing, scraping the soot loose with his brush. Chunks of ash fell like black rain, vanishing without a sound. Then, suddenly, the passage narrowed. The chimney bent sharply to the right. There was no room for mistakes. If he got stuck, no one would know exactly where. If he screamed, no one would hear. Here, in this darkness, the boy learned things no school could teach. He knew he had to be as light as smoke, as patient as stone, and to keep moving, no matter how tired he felt. Outside, perhaps the lady of the house was making tea, and the maid was cleaning the floor. Inside, there was only a small body, searching for the light in a tunnel of coal dust. It was like the scene in Princess Sarah when she was forced to clean the ashes while crying. Except this was no cartoon. This was a real house in a real city, in the year 1830, and the boy's name was neither Sarah nor Romeo. He was simply the boy who went through the chimney. But behind this darkness, someone was waiting outside. A man who neither smiled nor waited long. And here we see whose hand holds the rope and who pulls it. In a narrow alley behind a crowded market stood a quiet house. Inside lived the boys who worked the chimneys, not as friends and not as family, but as tools to be sent back out every morning. In the middle of the room sat the master, a middle-aged man who didn't laugh and rarely spoke. When he did, everyone fell silent. He didn't call the boys by their names. He signaled to them with numbers, gestures, or nothing at all. A glance was enough to tell a boy what to do. They woke before dawn, wearing the same filthy clothes from the day before. Each took his brush, his rope, and a handful of soot from yesterday's work. Then they waited for the signal. If anyone was late, there was a thin rod of beechwood. It didn't make a loud sound when it struck, but it left a mark you wouldn't forget. Food was scarce. a piece of hard bread, or a watery broth barely worthy of the name soup. No one complained, because complaints met not with listening ears, but with the rod. At night the boys slept close together, some on the floor, some with an arm under their head for a pillow. The only blanket was soot, which never left them, even in their sleep. The master never slept with them. He had his own room, his own bed, his own fireplace. What concerned him wasn't their comfort, only that every boy returned alive at the end of the day, not out of kindness, but because he didn't like losing a good tool, even one that breathed, cried, and collapsed from exhaustion. Sometimes the boys cried quietly at night. No one comforted anyone. Even tears were considered a luxury here. A new boy learned on his first day that this man never smiled, and that silence was his safest choice. Work fast, sleep fast, and keep your name off the punishment list. Life moved like the chimneys they cleaned, narrow, dark, and with no clear view of the light above. But the children didn't only suffer from cold and exhaustion. There was something else, something unseen. It began in silence, and from that silence, pain was born, just like smoke from a fire. He was no more than 7 years old, his face black with soot, his eyes searching for something he couldn't name. A man in a dark coat approached. He didn't look like a thief, and he didn't look like a rich gentleman, but he knew exactly what to say and when to say it. Do you want a warm place, a bed, food every day? The boy wasn't foolish, but he was hungry. That evening he entered a house where no paper was signed, no name was asked, and no one told him to return to anyone. From that moment he was one of the chimney boys, and the man had a new tool. In other cases, children were taken from poor families or from orphanages under the label of apprenticeship. Sometimes parents themselves handed their children over for a sum of money. It said some sold their sons for only 3 shillings. The law didn't ask questions, the streets didn't care, and the child had no voice. After weeks of work, the small body began to change. Knees never healed, hands cracked open, voices turned into coughs, but the worst wounds were the ones no one could see. One day, a boy returned, complaining of strange pains and sores that appeared without reason. The master ignored it. Let him sleep. He'll get better. He didn't. Weeks later, the pain became something else. At the time, no one knew the name, but years later, doctors would call it something new. Chimney sweep's cancer. It was the first cancer ever linked directly to an occupation, and its first victims were chimney boys. The chimney didn't burn alone. The body burned too, slowly, silently, without flame. And the smoke didn't always escape from the mouth. Sometimes it stayed inside, filling the lungs, smothering the child like an extinguished fire. The big houses didn't know this, or didn't want to. They saw clean hearths and warm rooms, but never asked who climbed up, who came down, and who didn't come back. But not all children vanished quietly. Some sang. Silence ruled everything inside a chimney. The silence of bricks, of coal, of fear. But sometimes a small voice would slip through the darkness, a child singing. He didn't sing because the work was pleasant or life was easy, but because he knew singing might save him. In the tall chimneys, singing was the only way to say, "I'm here, I'm still alive." The sound bounced between the walls and rose upward before the body did. Some boys invented their own words. Others repeated a song they once heard from their mother long ago, before they slept in the master's house. One day, a man in a house heard a faint sound from the fireplace. He leaned close and discovered the child inside was stuck, and if not for the song, no one would have known. But singing didn't fill an empty stomach, or heel burns, or warm blue fingers. Some sang to avoid crying. Others sang because they had no other words to say, and at night, when everyone slept, the song stayed trapped inside the chimney, like a small ghost refusing to leave. 100 years later came the film Mary Poppins, with its famous scene of chimney sweeps singing and dancing on London rooftops, filling the screen with both joy and soot. It's a beautiful scene, yes, but it isn't true. None of those real children danced on rooftops or tipped their hats to a camera. They crawled through the dark and sang, not for joy, but for survival. In their time, singing wasn't art. It was an urgent message. Save me if you can hear me. But sometimes, even a song wasn't enough. One day, a boy entered a chimney and never came out. It was an ordinary day, a large house, a working fireplace, and a small boy named James climbing into the chimney as usual. The master waited outside. He called to him, pulled the rope more than once, but there was no voice, no movement. At first, he thought James had fallen asleep. Then he thought it was a prank. But when he sent another boy in to try and reach him, they discovered the truth. James was stuck in the middle of the chimney, his body twisted painfully, his chest unable to find enough space to breathe. He stayed like that for hours, whispering at first, then fading into silence. Before anyone could reach him, he was gone. This time, the news didn't stay in the back alley. It reached the street, then the newspapers, then the Parliament. James was not the first child to die in a chimney, but his story came at a time when hearts were no longer as hard as they had been. People were tired of the silence. Voices began to rise. One member of Parliament stood in the chamber holding a picture of a small body blackened with soot. He asked, "How many children must we lose before we stop this hell?" In the next session, lawmakers were divided. Some said, "This is the way of the world." Others said, "The time has come to change the law." The debate was long, filled with argument, but when it ended, there was something new. In 1875, the British Parliament passed a law banning the use of children for chimney cleaning. It was the first real victory for those who had no voice. They say an elderly member left the chamber in tears and told his aide, "At last, we have done something worth crying for." But laws don't erase memories. They don't free the voices trapped in old chimneys. After this victory, a question remained. Had the tragedy truly ended, or had it only changed shape? It was now illegal to use children as chimney sweeps, but chimneys didn't disappear, and neither did poor children. Some households obeyed the new rules, replacing the boys with long brushes and letting them return to the streets. Others found nameless ways around the law. Work was passed under the table in small houses or far from the cities, where inspectors never came and newspapers never reached. The boy would still enter through the back door, but now he was told, "If anyone asks, you're just helping and you're not getting paid." And so the work continued in the shadows. The fireplaces still burned. The soot still fell. Time passed, and the trade shifted from necessity to memory. Coal gave way to gas. Electric heaters began changing the shape of homes. Bit by bit, chimneys grew cold. In some villages, old tools were found abandoned in attics. A long brush, a frayed rope, a single child's shoe. In a museum, a picture was placed. A boy wearing a worn cloth cap. The caption read, "One of the chimney sweeps from a time long forgotten." Visitors passed by, looked, and kept walking. No one remembered the names. No one knew how many went in and never came out. That place, unnamed, barely written about, still exists in our shared memory. It's where the story hid and where the soot slept. But soot never truly disappears. Some of it stays in the corners, in the pictures, in the voices that never escaped. Perhaps all that remains of these stories is a faint longing. In the corners of some old houses, chimneys still stand, unused but not demolished, covered in dust, with a thin strand of light slipping down from the top, like a faded thread from a distant memory. And when a visitor steps close, they might feel something unseen. Perhaps it's the cold, or perhaps it's something else, something like longing. In small museums, there are photos of children who do not smile, their eyes fixed on the camera as if unsure why it exists. Beside the photo, a black cap, an old rope, and a soot-worn brush. The picture doesn't tell the whole story. The rope doesn't show the pain. The brush doesn't explain the suffocating dark. In some history books, they appear only in a footnote, as if they were a side remark, not an entire chapter of suffering. But the truth is, they were not numbers. They were not shadows of the past. They were faces walking through the alleys, small feet climbing brick, faint voices singing from inside the walls. Perhaps today no one remembers their names or how their faces looked when they laughed. And because we cannot turn back time or erase what happened, our only duty is to remember. And so, this documentary ends, but their story does not. Because some stories do not close, like the old chimneys, but remain open, waiting for someone to listen.